Chapter 5 Interlude The Giraffes Among the Acacias. What follows is a brief, but I hope a useful, digression from my main argument. It is entirely concerned with a series of issues arising out of G.A. Cohen's formulation of, quote, traditional historical materialism. This chapter, which is the most philosophically technical in this book, may be skipped by those persuaded of my arguments thus far, and inclined to pursue Cohen further, since the aspect of his work I want to take up here, his functionalism, rests on premises I have already rejected. If my view of Marx's basic concepts is accepted, there is evidently no possibility of developing a general functional model, any more than there is of elaborating a general causal model of the forces, relations, or base superstructure relationship, as Cohen attempts. The issue of functional explanation in Marxism is worth discussing independently nonetheless for two main reasons. First, Cohen is undoubtedly correct that many forms of Marxism are tacitly functionalist. These forms of Marxism include certain internal relations perspectives, and I wish clearly to distinguish my own position from these. Functionalist formulations are also endemic in some variants of Marxist feminism. Second, and more importantly, Cohen maintains that Marx's claims in the 1859 preface can only be rendered coherent if they are interpreted functionally. Only thus, he contends, can we reconcile Marx's recognition that specific superstructures are conditions of existence for economic structures, and economic structures for development of the productive forces, with his assertion of the respective explanatory primacy of the latter term in each pair. Marxism, in Cohen's view, entails an inescapable commitment to functionalism. I believe Cohen to be right on this issue if, but only if, his definitions of the entities in question are accepted. Non-functionalist causal interpretations of the forces, relations, and base superstructure, quote, correspondences run into unavoidable problems of circularity of the sort raised by Acton. To this extent, Cohen renders Marxist debate a significant service in showing that an orthodox conception of Marx's basic concepts does entail a functional reading of his explanatory positions, a conclusion many Marxists have been reluctant to accept, even whilst wishing to maintain their conceptual orthodoxy. Interestingly, it was a recognition that only a covert teleology could reconcile a conception of superstructures as conditions of existence of economic structures with the assertion of economic determination, quote, in the last instance, which led Hindus and Hurst eventually to argue the, quote, necessary non-correspondence, end quote, of these supposed levels of social formation. For me, on the other hand, Cohen's demonstration of the unavoidability of functionalism within traditional historical materialism provides an additional and compelling reason for doing what I have argued for throughout this book, and rethinking these basic concepts themselves. For I shall argue that Cohen does not succeed in defending functional explanation. The alternatives are therefore to follow Hindus and Hurst out of the historical materialist framework entirely in the direction of a systematic pluralism, or to seek to reconstitute that framework on foundations very different from those of tradition. If we are to reject a functionalist version of Marx, in short, we must also abandon the familiar interpretation of his fundamental concepts. Functional explanation for Cohen is a distinctive explanatory procedure in which reference to the effects of a phenomenon contributes to explaining it. Functional explanation for Cohen is, quote, a distinctive explanatory procedure in which references to the effects of a phenomenon contributes to explaining it, end quote. It is a causal explanation, but a, quote, special type of causal explanation, deriving its peculiarity from generalizations of distinctive logical form, end quote. Cohen calls the logically distinctive generalizations on which explanations are based, quote, consequence laws. Cohen sets out the form of these laws as follows. If it is the case that if an event of type E were to occur at T1, then it would bring about the event of type F at T2. Then an event of type E occurs at time, I think the T3 is time 3, T3 at time 3. In practice, consequence explanations are invariably also functional explanations. That is, the explanandum event E is functional for something or other. Importantly, however, Cohen insists that this functionality is not a necessary feature of the structure of functional explanations, which is simply that of consequence explanations in general. It is at least logically possible to imagine a consequence explanation in which the explanandum event would be dysfunctional. We may therefore abstract from the functionality of the explanandum in characterizing functional explanations and describe them sufficiently by reference to their logical form, that of the consequence explanation alone. I assume Cohen insists on this in order to avoid standard objections to teleology. Though consequence explanations are causal, consequence explanations are not, for Cohen, quote, mere images of ordinary causal explanations, end quote. The logical form of the consequences laws, on which consequence explanations rest, differs from that of ordinary causal laws. He asserts nonetheless that, quote, a consequence statement explains when that consequence statement relates to a consequence law, in whatever way an explanatory precedence statement relates to a pertinent law, end quote. This means that, mutatis mutandis, a functional explanation can be cast in the familiar deductive nomological, hereafter dn, form, as set out classically by Hempel. In Cohen's words, an elementary consequence explanation, dn construed, would contain as first premise a consequence law, and as second, a statement asserting an instantiation of its major antecedent. The schema, where what is to be explained is the occurrence of an event of a certain type, would be as follows. L. If it is the case that if an event of type E were to occur at time 1, then it would bring about an event of type F at time 2. Then an event of type E occurs at time 3. Were an event of type E to occur at a particular time, it would bring about an event of type F at the next time. An event of type E occurs at the third time. Hope I'm reading that right. My logic skills are a little rusty. In an article of 1983, Cohen offers a less technical account of functional explanation than in his book, which I have followed so far. If E is a cause and F E's effect, the explanation is neither that E occurred because F occurred, nor that E occurred because it caused F. Either of these was the unacceptable consequence of requiring an effect temporally to precede its cause. The form of functional explanation Cohen favors is, quote, E occurred because E would cause F. Or less tersely, but more properly, E occurred because the situation was such that an event like E would cause an event like F, end quote. In functional explanation, quote, it is the fact that were an event of a certain type to occur, it would have a certain effect, which explains the occurrence of an event of the stated type, end quote. Cohen calls this fact, that described by the word he italicizes, a, quote, dispositional fact. Thus in Cohen's Marxism, the emergence of production relations of a given type is functionally explained by the dispositional fact that were such relations to emerge, those relations would promote development of the productive forces. Similarly with superstructures vis-a-vis bases. Cohen emphasizes additionally, and very importantly for my argument, that such explanations may be, quote, confirmed in the absence of a theory as to how the dispositional property figures in the explanatory explanation of what it explains. We may have good reason for thinking a functional explanation is true, even when we are at a loss to conjecture by what means or mechanism the functional fact achieves its explanatory rule, end quote. As Cohen's later article puts it, quote, to say that A explains B is not necessarily to indicate how A explains B. In a widely favored idiom, we might not know the mechanism linking cause and effect, or as I prefer to say, we may be unable to elaborate the explanation, end quote. Thus, specification of causal mechanisms is not for Cohen necessary to explanation. To use his own terms, explanations answer why questions, and we may be able to say why an event occurs without knowing how it occurs. In a functional explanation, the answer to the question why an event occurs is necessarily and sufficiently furnished by citation of the relevant consequence law and antecedent, dispositional conditions, exactly as within the conventional DN schema. To say why an event occurs is simply to invoke a covering causal law whose antecedent conditions are satisfied. Identification of causal mechanisms, saying how the explanandum event is actually brought about, pertains to what Cohen calls the, quote, elaboration of explanations. Such elaboration, the provision of a theory of causal mechanisms, may be desirable, but it is not in any way mandatory. Functional explanations as such are sufficiently characterized by their formulability in terms of Cohen's modified DN schema alone, and hence remain valid as explanations, even in the complete absence of theoretical elaboration. This is, of course, the standard position adopted by positivists and denied by realists with regard to ordinary causal explanations. Section 2. Discussion may best be advanced from here by considering one of Cohen's examples of functional explanation in more detail. I shall treat it as a paradigm. It is this: a population of giraffes with a mean neck length of 6 feet lives in an environment of acacia trees, on whose leaves they feed. The height of the trees makes it true that if the giraffes now had longer necks, their survival prospects would be better. They subsequently come to have longer necks. So far, all we have is evidence of a consequence generalization. But if Darwin's theory of evolution is true, then the fact that were they to have had longer necks, they would have fared better, contributes to explaining the elongation. The environment selects in favor of variants with longer necks, precisely because the environment is an environment in which longer necks improve life chances. And no construal can that dispositional fact be reduced to an explanatory precursor of the acquisition of the feature. Its explanatory relevance to the elongation of the neck is entailed by the Darwinian theory. End quote. Cohen then confronts an imaginary skeptic. He argues that the dispositional property, that the environment is of a kind in which longer necks would improve life chances, merely correlates with what really explains the elongation. This is, quote, the presence of the trees, a quite undispositional circumstance, end quote. Cohen replies as follows, quote, we can agree that it is the trees which, aided by the chance genetic variation, cause the neck of the species to grow. But what is it about the trees which makes them have that effect? Answer: where trees are of the given height, giraffes with longer necks would prosper better. The dispositional fact is an essential element in the explanatory story. End quote. Consistently with this disjunction between explanation and its elaboration, Cohen claims additionally that in this example, the dispositional fact is essential to the explanation of the lengthening of the giraffes' necks, irrespective of whether we favor Darwinian or Lamarckian accounts of how the elongation occurs. The latter, Cohen might have added, being a functionalist theory in the conventional teleological sense, and the former not. In Cohen's view, what we have in the Darwin-Lamarck dispute are, quote, rival theories of why a consequence explanation holds, not rival alternatives to consequence explanation. We see here the import of Cohen's denial that the functionality of explananda is necessary to structural characterization of functional explanation, and the way this connects with his explanation elaboration distinction. Insofar as the functionality of an explanandum enters into a putative causal account, as it does for Lamarck, it does so at the elaborative level. it is not necessary to the formulation of the consequence laws upon which functional explanation as such rests. Now, I believe in this example, Cohen misstates Darwin. When Darwin's theory is properly expressed, dispositional properties are not essential to explanation. There is a construal within which such, quote, dispositional facts are non-explanatory precursors of the elongation at issue. And that construal is standard Darwinian theory, at least as I understand it. Let me elaborate. In confronting his imaginary opponent, Cohen attributes that opponent the view that it is the presence of the trees which explains the elongation of the giraffes' necks. And this is not a dispositional circumstance. Cohen easily rebuts this. But a Darwinian would not, in fact, be likely to advance this argument. He would be more likely to argue in two stages, which Cohen conflates. First, the Darwinian would say that the initial appearance of long-necked giraffes is not explained by anything in the environment, quote, dispositional or otherwise, but by genetic mutation. Such mutations are random and Pace-Lamarckian theories altogether unconnected with environmental circumstance. It is this mutation which is the cause of a long-necked variant initially emerging, and the presence or absence of Acacias, importantly, makes it neither more nor less likely that this original adaptive mutation will occur, precisely because mutation is random. Indeed, it is perfectly conceivable that the mutation of the neck might not have occurred. Some species, after all, do actually die out. Consider dinosaurs. We can not then speak here of the operation of a consequence law. If E would cause F, then E. The presence of Acacias cannot therefore be said to, quote, dispose the genes to mutate in an appropriately adaptive way. To suppose otherwise is to fall into the fallacy of reasoning post hoc, ergo propter hoc. Second, our Darwinian would say that the survival of the long-necked variant, a different issue, is undoubtedly then explained ceteris paribus by the presence of the trees whose leaves the giraffes are better equipped to eat than their short-necked competitors. But dispositional propositions are in no way, quote, an essential part of the explanatory story, end quote, at this level of the explanation either. It is rather the case that given the fact of the mutation, the presence of the trees then does sufficiently explain the enhanced survival chances of the long-necked giraffes. That the mutated giraffes can eat acacia leaves and thus have a competitive advantage in the struggle for survival, in other words, remains a totally contingent consequence of their having fortuitously acquired long necks for reasons that are entirely unconnected with the environment or its supposedly dispositional properties. This can be expressed in standard DN form without any recourse to consequence laws. There's a little chart here. I'm going to try to explain it. Individuals well adapted to their environment will have competitive advantages over those less well developed. Such advantages over time ensure the survival of the fittest, and thus the generalization through a species of the relevant adaptive features. Some giraffes have long necks as a result of fortuitous genetic mutation. Giraffes live among tall acacia trees. Long-necked giraffes have a competitive advantage over short-necked giraffes in their natural habitat, and the long-necked variant will therefore prevail. Certainly, the character of the environment is an important part of the explanation of the generalization of long necks among the giraffe population, but not in the way Cohen supposes. Giraffes have long necks not because of the dispositional properties of the environment, but because of the complex interaction through time of genetic variation and environmental circumstance. These two factors on Darwin's theory, though not Lamarck's, being contingently connected. An adequate causal account of the acquisition of long necks by the giraffe species would thus have to combine a series of propositions concerning the population dynamics of giraffes, genetic variation in the giraffe population, and features of the environment, including the height of acacias. But none of these propositions would have to be dispositional for the explanatory story to make sense. As Cohen alleges, it is not the dispositional fact that were giraffes to have long necks, giraffes would fare better among the acacias, which in any case explains why the feature was acquired by some giraffes in the first place. And the explanation of why this variant then prevails supposes this initial acquisition of the feature. Given the mutation, moreover, presence of trees then does sufficiently explain the survival of long-necked giraffes, ceteris paribus. On the contrary, what is being offered in Darwinian theory is a historical and relational, a material explanation of what functionalism apparently explains, namely, the evident adaptation of giraffes to life among the acacias. It was, of course, exactly for this reason that Marx hailed the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species for dealing, quote, the death blow to teleology in the natural sciences, end quote, while setting forth its, quote, rational meaning in an empirical way, end quote. Darwin, Marx is saying, provided a material explanation of, and thereby makes rational, what superficially appears to be a teleological process. Cohen can construe the, quote, dispositional fact that environments with tall trees favor long-necked mammals as in itself explanatory only by short-circuiting this complex material account of how long necks were both initially acquired and subsequently generalized through the species. Section 3. This line of criticism of functional explanation is hardly new, but Cohen does not confront it. What I am saying, in effect, is that explanations in terms of Cohen's, quote, dispositional properties, unquote, can be entirely rewritten in straightforward causal terms, without any loss in content, but with a considerable gain in accuracy. Cohen's dispositional properties are contingent factors like the presence of acacias, which may feature as relevant antecedents in a perfectly conventional causal explanation, as of the long-necked giraffe's survival, if certain other equally contingent events, like mutation, occur, but they do not thereby explain why those other events occur in the first place. They merely appear to do so. As long as we remain ignorant of the real causal mechanisms at work. Somewhat paradoxically, the possibility of thus rewriting functional explanations as orthodoxally causal explanations is a consequence of Cohen's own insistence on eliminating the functionality of explananda from his characterization of, quote, consequence explanation. I could not have argued this case for all varieties of functional explanation. For Cohen, dispositional facts explain in exactly the same way that causal antecedents do. But this is not the case, for instance, in avowedly teleological explanations, in which ends are explanatory without being temporal antecedents. Such explanations, self-evidently, cannot be assimilated to orthodox Humean causal paradigms in the way Cohen attempts for his, quote, consequence explanations. Were the functionality of the explanandum event a necessary feature of functional explanation, the latter indeed would be a distinctive form of explanation, if an obviously dubious one, except when applied to entities capable of acting to achieve goals, like people or gods, and the translation of functional into causal propositions would be impossible without loss of the specifically teleological element in their content. For Cohen, though, causes lie in antecedent dispositional facts, not the functionality of explananda as such. And it is these supposed dispositional factors, I argue, can be causally rewritten. Now, it will be recalled that Cohen carefully distinguishes explanation and elaboration. The possibility of translating functional into causal propositions, however, depends precisely upon knowledge of what Cohen sees as extraneous to explanation strictu sensu, namely the causative mechanism he relegates to the category of elaboration of explanations. In his Darwinian example, it is only knowledge of random genetic variation which actually causes long-necked giraffes to emerge, which allows us to rewrite what appears to be an explanation in terms of the dispositional properties of an environment, as an explanation in terms of material causes operating within that environment. In the absence of knowledge of the real causal mechanism at work, it is indeed only the dispositional fact that Acacias favor species with long necks, precisely Darwin's explanandum, which appears capable of explaining the presence of giraffes. It is worth spelling it out that contrary to Cohen, this knowledge of causative mechanisms is not something through which we merely elaborate explanation, supplying the how to buttress the why we already know. It tells us rather than the functional answer to the question why, despite its initial plausibility, is wrong. Giraffes do not, except perhaps in a shorthand pardonable in biologists, but inexcusable in philosophers, have long necks because their environment is such that if they did, they would thrive in it. They have long necks by the luck of genetic draw, operating within given environmental conditions, certainly, but not in any way which is functionally explained by those conditions. Indeed, knowledge of mechanisms shows that there are in fact no consequence laws involved. As argued above, it in no way follows from the presence of acacias that the adaptive mutation actually will occur. If Darwinian theory is correct, we cannot say for this area, if E would cause F, E will occur. We can reach this last conclusion, however, in defiance of manifest correlations of species and environments. Only because we know the adaptive mechanism, in fact, to be random. The causal elaboration, in short, actually vitiates the supposedly functional explanation. It shows the dispositional features of the environment not to be the explanatory factor, appearances notwithstanding. By the same token, we should not suppose production relations and superstructures take the forms they do because they respectively serve productive forces and economic structures, even if they manifestly do, without a far more convincing defense of functional explanation than Cohen supplies. It may, on the contrary, be the case that, say, a, quote, superstructural feature arising out of eminently non-economic causes is quite contingently able to facilitate certain economic developments, as the mutation does the survival of giraffes on the plains of Africa. In such cases, the feature should properly belong, in the first instance, in the causal explanans of why a given economic structure is able to emerge, and not by functional sleight of hand be numbered among its explananda. There goes some lawnmowers, of course. Once the mode of production is on its feet, the environment it constitutes for the superstructural feature at issue might in turn help explain the latter's persistence, as the continued presence of acacias does the survival of long-necked giraffes. But if it did, it would do so materially, not functionally. Examples of this might include, in the case of capitalism, Weber's Protestant ethic or the English common law. Few sociologists would deny the pertinence of either for capitalist development, but only a historical ignoramus would ascribe them capitalist origins. Many would accept that whatever their origins, the survival of both was considerably facilitated by the success of the capitalist economic structure they arguably helped give rise to. Christopher Hill argues this brilliantly for both Protestantism and the common law as summated in Koch's Institutes. The seductiveness, a fatal seductiveness, of Cohen's functionalist model is that, like much bad Marxism, it apparently allows us to have our cake and eat it. Technological and economic determinisms can be maintained in a dispositional form in which straightforward empirical challenges cannot be used to refute them. I would argue, however, that to hold, as Cohen must, that such superstructural factors as Protestantism and law are, quote, selected for by bases, or bases by productive forces, at best obscures explanation of their real material causes, while to excavate the latter, schisms in the church, the strength of the Norman and Angevin monarchies, in such like eminently undispositional factors, is likely to reveal the alleged selection to be as contingent and, quote, dispositional explanation as spurious, as in Cohen's mistreatment of Darwin. To sever explanation and elaboration, in short, is to evade explanation in any material sense entirely. In the case of Marxism, it is to substitute theory for history. Functional explanations can masquerade as explanatory only as long as material causes remain unexplicated. This brings me to the major point I want to make here. What is most striking in Cohen's formulation of functional explanation has not generally been raised in debates around this book. is that he sees it as a variant of causal explanation. Albeit a distinctive kind, as the latter is understood within the mainstream positivist tradition. Cohen's use of Hempel's DN schema is indicative. Within this tradition, which derives ultimately from Hume, a cause is understood in terms simply of constant conjunction, if P then Q, of terms between which no necessary connection obtains. To give a causal explanation of something is according merely to show that that thing instantiates a covering law, the covering law being a universal conditional relating empirical particulars. Cohen formulates the relation between his consequence laws and the consequence statements in exactly the same way. His expunging of considerations of mechanism from explanation proper and attempt to characterize the latter in terms of its logical form alone is likewise wholly of a piece with the positivist project. But Cohen ignores here the entire and currently very influential realist tradition in the philosophy of science, which has many adherents within or sympathetic to Marxism. Indeed, there is now a large literature which seeks to annex Marx to the realist cause. Now, for realism, expressibility in DN form is certainly not sufficient, and for some realists like Bhaskar, is not even always necessary to qualify a series of propositions. Now, for realism, expressibility in DN form is certainly not sufficient, and for some realists like Bhaskar, is not even always necessary to qualify a series of propositions as an explanation. Another way of putting this is to say that what is entailed in giving an adequate explanation cannot be sufficiently described by giving an account of its logical form alone. The covering law model, accordingly, does not adequately characterize what scientists or ordinary language actually mean when they speak of a cause. Keat and Urey use a famous illustrative example. The onset of measles is invariably preceded by the presence of small white marks in the lining of the cheeks, known as Koplik spots. The latter have both of the necessity characteristics of a Humean cause, temporal precedence and invariant succession, and could therefore serve as a major premise to DN explanations of the form, if Koplik spots, then measles. And if DN formulability suffices to characterize what is required for an explanation, then we have no good reason not to explain measles as the outcome of Koplik spots. Yet we would not ordinarily want to say that the spots cause the measles. The cause, rather, is the invasion of bodily cells by a virus of the family Paramyxoviridae, of which Koplik spots are an early manifestation. Certainly, we may predict the imminent onset of measles from the presence of Koplik spots, but the spots do not in any meaningful sense explain the disease. Ascription of causes, explanation for realist critics of positivism, necessarily entails giving an account of the actual mechanisms through which a given effect is seen as being really produced. In this case, the activities of the virus. It is only in virtue of such an account that we can differentiate real causes from merely incidental correlations, or stop a potentially infinite causal regress of empirical antecedents. This in turn requires what Bhaskar calls ontological depth, the invocation of real and sometimes invisible entities, distinct from the phenomenon observed, whose characteristics, properties, and powers are capable of explaining those phenomena in this materially causal sense. Such are viruses with measles and genes with giraffes' necks. This conception of causal explanation clearly deviates considerably from Hempel's authoritative characterization of the positivist model, which Cohen straightforwardly accepts, for it essentially involves going beyond mere empirical regularities. Indeed, for realism, such regularities, like the manifest adaptedness of species to their environments, are characteristically part of science's explananda. An instance in Marx would be the correlation between fertility of the land and differential rent, which he does not accept as in itself explanatory. This means that giving a causal explanation necessarily involves elaborating a theory of causal mechanisms. It is only such a theory which makes a series of propositions into an explanation. We cannot answer a why question except by saying how. We cannot give a properly causal explanation without elaboration. For it is precisely in the supposed elaboration, the development of a theory of mechanisms, that explanation, as distinct from explanatory or insufficiently explanatory correlations of the Koplik spots / measles or Acacias / long necks variety, finally consists. In my final chapter, I shall argue that in Marx the analogous mechanisms lie ultimately in the actions of real individuals, and that causal explanation of such phenomenon must accordingly be historical. We do not explain such things as Protestantism or law by their functionality, but their genealogy. To defend realism, whether as a philosophy of science or in relation to Marx's method, is beyond the remit of this book. I have made some gestures in this direction elsewhere, but it is not irrelevant to my overall argument to suggest that what finally vitiates Cohen's account of functional explanation is exactly what realists argue undermines positivism: the lack of any material conception of cause. For Cohen's characterization of functional explanation is, as he goes to some length to show, a variant of Hempel's DN model. Had Cohen operated with a material understanding of cause, he would never have made the mistake he did with the giraffes, excluding what actually makes their nicks grow from the category of explanation proper, whilst ascribing a contingent empirical correlate, the dispositional properties of the environment, an illusory causal role. Nor would Cohen have had the gall, or should I say, the historical ignorance, comprehensible only in an analytic philosopher, to suggest that, in effect, in the social world we have explained a phenomenon by demonstrating its functionality for another, whilst establishing how it was brought about, or is materially sustained, is a mere optional extra, irrelevant to the truth or falsity of our supposed explanations. To call such a procedure either historical or materialist is a travesty of either adjective, and about as far away from Marx as we could conceivably get.